Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 29, in which certain incidents are narrated which are only to be met with on American railroads. The train pursued its course that evening without interruption, passing Fort Saunders, crossing Cheyenne Pass, and reaching Evans Pass. The road here attained the highest elevation of the journey, 8,092 feet above the level of the sea. The travelers had now only to descend to the Atlantic by limitless plains leveled by nature. A branch of the Grand Trunk led off southward to Denver, the capital of Colorado. The country round about is rich in gold and silver, and more than 50,000 inhabitants are already settled there. 1,382 miles had been passed over from San Francisco in 3 days and 3 nights. 4 days and 4 nights more would probably bring them to New York. Phileas Fogg was not as yet behindhand. During the night Camp Walbach was passed on the left. Lodge Pole Creek ran parallel with the road, marking the boundary between the territories of Wyoming and Colorado. They entered Nebraska at 11, passed near Sedgwick, and touched at Julesburg, on the southern branch of the Platte River. It was here that the Union Pacific Railroad was inaugurated on the 23rd of October, 1867, by the chief engineer, General Dodge. 2 powerful locomotives, carrying 9 cars of invited guests, among whom were Thomas C. Durant, vice president of the road, stopped at this point. Cheers were given. The Sioux and Pawnees performed an imitation Indian battle. Fireworks were let off, and the first number of the Railway Pioneer was printed by a press brought on the train. Thus was celebrated the inauguration of this great railroad, a mighty instrument of progress and civilization thrown across the desert and destined to link together cities and towns which do not yet exist. The whistle of the locomotive, more powerful than Amphion's lyre, was about to bid them rise from American soil. Fort McPherson was left behind at 8 in the morning, and 357 miles had yet to be traversed before reaching Omaha. The road followed the capricious windings of the southern branch of the Platte River, on its left bank. At 9 the train stopped at the important town of North Platte, built between the 2 arms of the river, which rejoin each other around it and form a single artery, a large tributary, whose waters empty into the Missouri a little above Omaha. The 101st meridian was passed. Mr. Fogg and his partners had resumed their game. No one, not even the dummy, complained of the length of the trip. Fix had begun by winning several guineas, which he seemed likely to lose, but he showed himself a not less eager whist player than Mr. Fogg. During the morning chance distinctly favored that gentleman. Trumps and honors were showered upon his hands. Once, having resolved on a bold stroke, he was on the point of playing a spade when a voice behind him said, "I should play a diamond." Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Fix raised their heads and beheld Colonel Proctor. Stamp Proctor and Phileas Fogg recognized each other at once.
"Ah, it's you, is it, Englishman?" cried the colonel. "It's you who are going to play a spade."
"And who plays it?" replied Phileas Fogg coolly, throwing down the 10 of spades.
"Well, it pleases me to have it diamonds," replied Colonel Proctor in an insolent tone.
He made a movement as if to seize the card which had just been played, adding,
"You don't understand anything about whist."
"Perhaps I do, as well as another," said Phileas Fogg, rising.
"You have only to try, son of John Bull," replied the colonel.
Aouda turned pale, and her blood ran cold. She seized Mr. Fogg's arm and gently pulled him back. Passepartout was ready to pounce upon the American, who was staring insolently at his opponent. But Fix got up, and going to Colonel Proctor said, "You forget that it is I with whom you have to deal, sir, for it was I whom you not only insulted but struck." "Mr. Fix," said Mr. Fogg, "pardon me, but this affair is mine, and mine only. The colonel has again insulted me by insisting that I should not play a spade, and he shall give me satisfaction for it."
"When and where you will," replied the American, "and with whatever weapon you choose."
Aouda in vain attempted to retain Mr. Fogg, as vainly did the detective endeavour to make the quarrel his. Passepartout wished to throw the colonel out of the window, but a sign from his master checked him. Phileas Fogg left the car, and the American followed him upon the platform. "Sir," said Mr. Fogg to his adversary, "I am in a great hurry to get back to Europe, and any delay whatever will be greatly to my disadvantage."
"Well, what's that to me?"
replied Colonel Proctor. "Sir," said Mr. Fogg very politely, "after our meeting at San Francisco I determined to return to America and find you as soon as I had completed the business which called me to England."
"Really?"
"Will you appoint a meeting for 6 months hence?"
"Why not 10 years hence?"
"I say 6 months," returned Phileas Fogg, "and I shall be at the place of meeting promptly."
"All this is an evasion," cried Stamp Proctor. "Now or never."
"Very good. You are going to New York?"
"No."
"To Chicago?"
"No."
"To Omaha?"
"What difference is it to you? Do you know Plum Creek?"
"No," replied Mr. Fogg.
"It's the next station. The train will be there in an hour, and will stop there 10 minutes. In 10 minutes several revolver shots could be exchanged."
"Very well," said Mr. Fogg. "I will stop at Plum Creek."
"And I guess you'll stay there, too," added the American insolently.
"Who knows?" replied Mr. Fogg, returning to the car as coolly as usual. He began to reassure Aouda, telling her that blusterers were never to be feared, and begged Fix to be his second at the approaching duel, a request which the detective could not refuse. Mr. Fogg resumed the interrupted game with perfect calmness. At 11 o'clock the locomotive's whistle announced that they were approaching Plum Creek station. Mr. Fogg rose, and followed by Fix, went out upon the platform. Passepartout accompanied him, carrying a pair of revolvers. Aouda remained in the car, as pale as death. The door of the next car opened, and Colonel Proctor appeared on the platform, attended by a Yankee of his own stamp as his second. But just as the combatants were about to step from the train, the conductor hurried up and shouted, "You can't get off, gentlemen."
"Why not?"
asked the colonel. "We are 20 minutes late, and we shall not stop."
"But I'm going to fight a duel with this gentleman."
"I'm sorry," said the conductor, "but we shall be off at once. There's the bell ringing now." The train started. "I'm really very sorry, gentlemen," said the conductor. "Under any other circumstances I should have been happy to oblige you. But after all, as you have not had time to fight here, why not fight as we go along?"
"That wouldn't be convenient, perhaps, for this gentleman," said the colonel in a jeering tone.
"It would be perfectly so," replied Phileas Fogg.
"Well, we are really in America," thought Passepartout, "and the conductor is a gentleman of the first order."
So muttering, he followed his master. The two combatants, their seconds, and the conductor passed through the cars to the rear of the train. The last car was only occupied by a dozen passengers, whom the conductor politely asked if they would not be so kind as to leave it vacant for a few moments, as two gentlemen had an affair of honor to settle. The passengers granted the request with alacrity, and straightway disappeared on the platform. The car, which was some 50 feet long, was very convenient for their purpose. The adversaries might march on each other in the aisle, and fire at their ease. Never was duel more easily arranged. Mr. Fogg and Colonel Proctor, each provided with 2 6-barreled revolvers, entered the car. The seconds, remaining outside, shut them in. They were to begin firing at the first whistle of the locomotive. After an interval of 2 minutes, what remained of the two gentlemen would be taken from the car. Nothing could be more simple. Indeed, it was all so simple that Fix and Passepartout felt their hearts beating as if they would crack. They were listening for the whistle agreed upon, when suddenly savage cries resounded in the air, accompanied by reports, which certainly did not issue from the car where the duelists were. The reports continued in front and the whole length of the train. Cries of terror proceeded from the interior of the cars. Colonel Proctor and Mr. Fogg, revolvers in hand, hastily quitted their prison, and rushed forward where the noise was most clamorous. They then perceived that the train was attacked by a band of Sioux. This was not the first attempt of these daring Indians, for more than once they had waylaid trains on the road. 100 of them had, according to their habit, jumped upon the steps without stopping the train, with the ease of a clown mounting a horse at full gallop. The Sioux were armed with guns, from which came the reports, to which the passengers, who were almost all armed, responded by revolver shots. The Indians had first mounted the engine, and half stunned the engineer and stoker with blows from their muskets. A Sioux chief, wishing to stop the train, but not knowing how to work the regulator, had opened wide, instead of closing, the steam valve, and the locomotive was plunging forward with terrific velocity. The Sioux had, at the same time, invaded the cars, skipping like enraged monkeys over the roofs, thrusting open the doors, and fighting hand to hand with the passengers. Penetrating the baggage car, they pillaged it, throwing the trunks out of the train. The cries and shots were constant. The travelers defended themselves bravely. Some of the cars were barricaded, and sustained a siege like moving forts, carried along at a speed of 100 miles an hour. Aouda behaved courageously from the first. She defended herself like a true heroine with a revolver, which she shot through the broken windows whenever a savage made his appearance. 20 Sioux had fallen mortally wounded to the ground, and the wheels crushed those who fell upon the rails as if they had been worms. Several passengers, shot or stunned, lay on the seats. It was necessary to put an end to the struggle, which had lasted for 10 minutes, and which would result in the triumph of the Sioux if the train was not stopped. Fort Kearny station, where there was a garrison, was only 2 miles distant, but, that once passed, the Sioux would be masters of the train between Fort Kearny and the station beyond. The conductor was fighting beside Mr. Fogg, when he was shot and fell. At the same moment he cried, "Unless the train is stopped in 5 minutes, we are lost." "It shall be stopped," said Phileas Fogg, preparing to rush from the car.
"Stay, monsieur," cried Passepartout. "I will go."
Mr. Fogg had not time to stop the brave fellow, who, opening a door unperceived by the Indians, succeeded in slipping under the car, and while the struggle continued and the balls whizzed across each other over his head, he made use of his old acrobatic experience, and with amazing agility worked his way under the cars, holding on to the chains, aiding himself by the brakes and the edges of the sashes, creeping from one car to another with marvelous skill, and thus gaining the forward end of the train. There, suspended by one hand between the baggage car and the tender, with the other he loosened the safety chains, but, owing to the traction, he would never have succeeded in unscrewing the yoking bar, had not a violent concussion jolted this bar out. The train, now detached from the engine, remained a little behind, whilst the locomotive rushed forward with increased speed. Carried on by the force already acquired, the train still moved for several minutes, but the brakes were worked, and at last they stopped less than 100 feet from Kearny station. The soldiers of the fort, attracted by the shots, hurried up. The Sioux had not expected them, and decamped in a body before the train entirely stopped. But when the passengers counted each other on the station platform, several were found missing, among others the courageous Frenchman, whose devotion had just saved them. Chapter 30, in which Phileas Fogg simply does his duty. 3 passengers, including Passepartout, had disappeared. Had they been killed in the struggle? Were they taken prisoners by the Sioux? It was impossible to tell. There were many wounded, but none mortally. Colonel Proctor was one of the most seriously hurt. He had fought bravely, and a ball had entered his groin. He was carried into the station with the other wounded passengers, to receive such attention as could be of avail. Aouda was safe, and Phileas Fogg, who had been in the thickest of the fight, had not received a scratch. Fix was slightly wounded in the arm. But Passepartout was not to be found, and tears coursed down Aouda's cheeks. All the passengers had got out of the train, the wheels of which were stained with blood. From the tires and spokes hung ragged pieces of flesh. As far as the eye could reach on the white plain behind, red trails were visible. The last Sioux were disappearing in the south, along the banks of the Republican River. Mr. Fogg, with folded arms, remained motionless. He had a serious decision to make. Aouda, standing near him, looked at him without speaking, and he understood her look. If his servant was a prisoner, ought he not to risk everything to rescue him from the Indians? "I will find him, living or dead," said he quietly to Aouda.
"Ah, Mr. Fogg!" cried she, clasping his hands and covering them with tears.
"Living," added Mr. Fogg, "if we do not lose a moment." Phileas Fogg, by this resolution, inevitably sacrificed himself. He pronounced his own doom. The delay of a single day would make him lose the steamer at New York, and his bet would be certainly lost. But as he thought, "It is my duty," he did not hesitate. The commanding officer of Fort Kearny was there. 100 of his soldiers had placed themselves in a position to defend the station should the Sioux attack it. "Sir," said Mr. Fogg to the captain, "3 passengers have disappeared."
"Dead?" asked the captain.
"Dead or prisoners, that is the uncertainty which must be solved. Do you propose to pursue the Sioux?" "That's a serious thing to do, sir," returned the captain. "These Indians may retreat beyond the Arkansas, and I cannot leave the fort unprotected." "The lives of 3 men are in question, sir," said Phileas Fogg. "Doubtless, but can I risk the lives of 50 men to save 3?" "I don't know whether you can, sir, but you ought to do so." "Nobody here," returned the other, "has a right to teach me my duty." "Very well," said Mr. Fogg, coldly. "I will go alone." "You, sir!" cried Fix, coming up. "You go alone in pursuit of the Indians?" "Would you have me leave this poor fellow to perish, him to whom everyone present owes his life? I shall go." "No, sir, you shall not go alone," cried the captain, touched in spite of himself. "No, you are a brave man. 30 volunteers," he added, turning to the soldiers. The whole company started forward at once. The captain had only to pick his men. 30 were chosen, and an old sergeant placed at their head. "Thanks, Captain," said Mr. Fogg. "Would you let me go with you?" asked Fix. "Do as you please, sir. But if you wish to do me a favor, you will remain with Aouda, in case anything should happen to me." A sudden pallor overspread the detective's face. Separate himself from the man whom he had so persistently followed step by step. Leave him to wander about in this desert. Fix gazed attentively at Mr. Fogg, and despite his suspicions and of the struggle which was going on within him, he lowered his eyes before that calm and frank look. "I will stay," said he. A few moments after, Mr. Fogg pressed the young woman's hand, and, having confided to her his precious carpet-bag, went off with the sergeant and his little squad. But before going he had said to the soldiers, "My friends, I will divide $5,000 among you if we save the prisoners." It was then a little past noon. Aouda retired to a waiting-room, and there she waited alone, thinking of the simple and noble generosity, the tranquil courage of Phileas Fogg. He had sacrificed his fortune, and was now risking his life, all without hesitation, from duty, in silence. Fix did not have the same thoughts, and could scarcely conceal his agitation. He walked feverishly up and down the platform, but soon resumed his outward composure. He now saw the folly of which he had been guilty in letting Fogg go alone. What? This man, whom he had just followed around the world, was permitted now to separate himself from him. He began to accuse and abuse himself, and, as if he were director of police, administered to himself a sound lecture for his greenness. "I have been an idiot," he thought, "and this man will see it. He has gone and won't come back. But how is it that I, Fix, who have in my pocket a warrant for his arrest, have been so fascinated by him? Decidedly I am nothing but an ass." So reasoned the detective, while the hours crept by all too slowly. He did not know what to do. Sometimes he was tempted to tell Aouda all, but he could not doubt how the young woman would receive his confidences. What course should he take? He thought of pursuing Fogg across the vast white plains. It did not seem impossible that he might overtake him. Footsteps were easily printed on the snow. But soon, under a new sheet, every imprint would be effaced. Fix became discouraged. He felt a sort of insurmountable longing to abandon the game altogether. He could now leave Fort Kearny station and pursue his journey homeward in peace. Towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while it was snowing hard, long whistles were heard approaching from the east. A great shadow, preceded by a wild light, slowly advanced, appearing still larger through the mist, which gave it a fantastic aspect. No train was expected from the east, neither had there been time for the succor asked for by telegraph to arrive. The train from Omaha to San Francisco was not due till the next day. The mystery was soon explained. The locomotive, which was slowly approaching with deafening whistles, was that which, having been detached from the train, had continued its route with such terrific rapidity, carrying off the unconscious engineer and stoker. It had run several miles, when, the fire becoming low for want of fuel, the steam had slackened, and it had finally stopped an hour after, some 20 miles beyond Fort Kearny. Neither the engineer nor the stoker was dead, and, after remaining for some time in their swoon, had come to themselves. The train had then stopped. The engineer, when he found himself in the desert and the locomotive without cars, understood what had happened. He could not imagine how the locomotive had become separated from the train, but he did not doubt that the train left behind was in distress. He did not hesitate what to do. It would be prudent to continue on to Omaha, for it would be dangerous to return to the train, which the Indians might still be engaged in pillaging. Nevertheless, he began to rebuild the fire in the furnace. The pressure again mounted, and the engineer returned, running backwards to Fort Kearny. This it was which was whistling in the mist. The travelers were glad to see the locomotive resume its place at the head of the train. They could now continue the journey so terribly interrupted. Aouda, on seeing the locomotive come up, hurried out of the station and asked the conductor, "Are you going to start?" "At once, madam." "But the prisoners, our unfortunate fellow travelers?" "I cannot interrupt the trip," replied the conductor. "We are already 3 hours behind time." "And when will another train pass here from San Francisco?" "Tomorrow evening, madam." "Tomorrow evening! But then it will be too late. We must wait." "It is impossible," responded the conductor. "If you wish to go, please get in." "I will not go," said Aouda. Fix had heard this conversation. A little while before, when there was no prospect of proceeding on the journey, he had made up his mind to leave Fort Kearny. But now that the train was there, ready to start, and he had only to take his seat in the car, an irresistible influence held him back. The station platform burned his feet, and he could not stir. The conflict in his mind began again. Anger and failure stifled him. He wished to struggle on to the end. Meanwhile the passengers and some of the wounded, among them Colonel Proctor, whose injuries were serious, had taken their places in the train. The buzzing of the overheated boiler was heard, and the steam was escaping from the valves. The engineer whistled, the train started, and soon disappeared, mingling its white smoke with the eddies of the densely falling snow. The detective had remained behind. Several hours passed. The weather was dismal and it was very cold. Fix sat motionless on a bench at the station. He might have been thought asleep. Aouda, despite the storm, kept coming out of the waiting room, going to the end of the platform, and peering through the tempest of snow as if to pierce the mist that narrowed the horizon around her, and to hear, if possible, some welcome sound. She heard and saw nothing. Then she would return, chilled through, to issue out again after the lapse of a few moments, but always in vain. Evening came, and the little band had not returned. Where could they be? Had they found the Indians, and were they having a conflict with them, or were they still wandering amid the mist? The commander of the fort was anxious, though he tried to conceal his apprehensions. As night approached, the snow fell less plentifully, but it became intensely cold. Absolute silence rested on the plains. Neither flight of bird nor passing of beast troubled the perfect calm. Throughout the night Aouda, full of sad forebodings, her heart stifled with anguish, wandered about on the verge of the plains. Her imagination carried her far off, and showed her innumerable dangers. What she suffered through the long hours it would be impossible to describe. Fix remained stationary in the same place, but did not sleep. Once a man approached and spoke to him, and the detective merely replied by shaking his head. Thus the night passed. At dawn the half-extinguished disk of the sun rose above a misty horizon, but it was now possible to recognize objects 2 miles off. Phileas Fogg and the squad had gone southward. In the south all was still vacancy. It was then 7 o'clock. The captain, who was really alarmed, did not know what course to take. Should he send another detachment to the rescue of the first? Should he sacrifice more men, with so few chances of saving those already sacrificed? His hesitation did not last long, however. Calling one of his lieutenants, he was on the point of ordering a reconnaissance, when gunshots were heard. Was it a signal? The soldiers rushed out of the fort, and half a mile off they perceived a little band returning in good order. Mr. Fogg was marching at their head, and just behind him were Passepartout and the other 2 travelers, rescued from the Sioux. They had met and fought the Indians 10 miles south of Fort Kearny. Shortly before the detachment arrived, Passepartout and his companions had begun to struggle with their captors, 3 of which the Frenchman had felled with his fists, when his master and the soldiers hastened up to their relief. All were welcomed with joyful cries. Phileas Fogg distributed the reward he had promised to the soldiers, while Passepartout, not without reason, muttered to himself, "It must certainly be confessed that I cost my master dear." Fix, without saying a word, looked at Mr. Fogg, and it would have been difficult to analyze the thoughts which struggled within him. As for Aouda, she took her protector's hand and pressed it in her own, too much moved to speak. Meanwhile Passepartout was looking about for the train. He thought he should find it there, ready to start for Omaha, and he hoped that the time lost might be regained. "The train! The train!" cried he. "Gone," replied Fix. "And when does the next train pass here?" said Phileas Fogg. "Not till this evening." "Ah," returned the impassible gentleman quietly. End of chapter.